Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are very honored and pleased to have with us today Rabbi Reuven Brand. Rabbi Brand holds a master's degree in Jewish education from the Azrieli Graduate School of Education and Administration and a BA in history from Yeshiva College. Rabbi Brand received rabbinic ordination Semicha from REITS, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. Previously, Rabbi Brand served as rabbinic assistant at Congregation Shomrei Torah in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. And Rabbi Brand is the founding Rosh Kollel of the Yeshiva University Torah Mitzion Kollel of Chicago and Dean of the Midwest Center for Jewish Learning. Rabbi Brand also holds the Bobins Family Chair in Community Jewish Scholarship. Rabbi Brand, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
Shalom Aleichem, and thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And today we will be discussing and looking at a fascinating and extremely relevant topic, religious Zionism. That's a big topic, but we'll try to at least tackle parts of it. Just to start, Rabbi Brand, how would you define religious Zionism, and who were the initial proponents of religious Zionism, and what were their views?
So I come to this topic in different ways, but one of them I would say important to note is that as part of our Kollel over the past 16 years, we've had a tremendous influence of Chavrei HaKollel who came from Israel from a what you could call quote unquote religious Zionist background. In Hebrew, you would call that Dati Leumi. We've had opportunities to learn Torah from great Gaonim who are identified with this group. So having had the opportunity to learn a lot about it has been extremely meaningful and eye-opening for me. Religious Zionism, we take those two words, and the word religious brings us to the idea that there is an expectation that the Ribbono Shel Olam, God, has for us, and that expectation is expressed in different ways. And one of those expectations is Zionism. Zionism, perhaps for this context, we can define concisely as the national, practical movement of resettling the land of Israel. So if we view the collective effort to practically buy, build, and settle the land of effort as part of our spiritual worldview of our Avodas Hashem, then that is an integrated religious Zionist perspective on life.
Okay. And again, the initial proponents, a little history of religious Zionism and what their views were initially.
So it's really interesting that oftentimes people think about Zionism as a movement which gained strength at the end of the 19th century in the wake of significant anti-Jewish persecution and pogroms and the Dreyfus Affair. But the truth is that actually, what you could call proto-Zionists, the pre-secular Zionist discussions about the return to the land of Israel, these discussions were had by great Rabbanim and Gedolim. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a movement, an awareness that perhaps it would be somehow politically or even economically feasible to return to Eretz Israel and theoretically rebuild a Yishuv and even the Beis Hamikdash. And that's why some are familiar with the great Shuvas of the Binyan Zion, Rav Yaakov Tzvi Edliger, who was the Rebbe of one of the Rabbeim of Rav Shmuel Hirsch. Rav Hirsch's Rebbe wrote a Shuva Binyan Zion about the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash, about this issue, because that's what the Talmidei Chachamim in the first half, in the middle of the 19th century were talking about. People like Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher and the Malbim and others, names some of which are familiar to us. This was a discussion among Talmidei Chachamim. Can we go back? What does it mean? And what are the halachic parameters? So there was already a discussion about this idea of returning to the land. And then, of course, with more of a nationalistic eye toward this, secular Zionists, after which is way beyond the discussion for today, but after the influence of the Enlightenment and the Haskalah, the Chule, so these enlightened Jews who were looking for more of a national perspective at the end of the 19th century. So there were many Gedolim, many Gaonei Torah, Tzaddikim who opposed collaborating with them, but there were others who felt that even though these people were potentially halachically categorized as Rishonim, or they were anti-Torah, anti-religious, but there were opportunities to see, A, what they were doing as something that could be channeled to something good, B, that what they were doing inherently was good in building the land, and there were ways to forge partnerships to perhaps try to give them direction in the right way. So now, by the end of the 19th century, you have different groups of religious people who were in favor of working with Zionists, and even parallel to that, there was a great Hasidic leader, the Emrei Emes, the Heilige Ger Rebbe, who made 2 trips to Israel and was a very important voice, one of the leaders of the Agudas Yisrael movement, who guided the Aguda not to work with secular Zionists, but the importance of settling the land as a national movement, not working with Zionists, but just as a value of the Aguda community, that was important already at the beginning of the 20th century.
One of the seminal leaders of the Jewish people in the 20th century was certainly Rav Avraham Isaac Kook, Rav Kook, who became the first chief rabbi in Israel before the state. Was Rav Kook a religious Zionist, as we understand it? And how did his views fit in with those early religious Zionists?
So Rav Kook was a giant, a spiritual light that probably, we could say, could not be contained in the vessels that many people have in their world. And so what he saw, maybe others didn't always see. Rav Kook was a person who spanned every dimension and discipline of Torah learning and Torah living. And part of Rav Kook's worldview was the centrality of Eretz Israel, the centrality of the nation of Israel, and how those two are interrelated. And Rav Kook has a letter early in the 1900s where he says, I don't know any rabbi who's anti-Zionist. Meaning for Rav Kook, it was obvious and important that the nation be moving toward the process of the culmination of the Gullus. Also, Rav Kook would say this is really the process, the unfolding process of redemption of Geula throughout history. And now we're at a stage where the nation is awakening and returning to its land. That is a natural spiritual process for Rav Kook. So Rav Kook saw the people who were the instruments of this movement. Maybe it was unfortunate, but the Ribono Shel Olam chose, the reality was that those secular Jews who were leading the Zionist movement, they were the ones who were enabling this return to the land of Israel. So Rav Kook certainly strongly encouraged mass aliyah. He collaborated and worked closely with Zionist leaders in different ways. Rav Kook embraced, let's say, thinkers and writers, even though they were secular, because they expressed the national awakening. At the same time, Rav Kook was not shy. There's a letter that he wrote to the Zionist Congress bemoaning and sharply criticizing the phenomenon that existed, that there was a speaker, or it sounds like maybe even more than one speaker, who denounced religious life at a Zionist conference. He said that can't be tolerated. That can't be tolerated in any way. And so Rav Kook's goal was to see this movement be guided ultimately to an expression of Kedusha, of holiness of the nation of Israel. So Rav Kook, it would seem, was certainly a religious Zionist, and he was much more than that.
Was this something that Rav Kook picked up while he was in the great Yeshiva of Volozhin? Was this a theme that the Netziv in Volozhin or other leaders of the Volozhin Yeshiva had imbued in some of the students or in all of the students?
So it's a very good question, and I am not sufficiently versed in the exact nuances of what was happening with Rav Kook in Volozhin. As you mentioned, he was one of the close disciples of the Netziv. Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was the towering rabbinic figure of that era in Volozhin in terms of the leadership of the yeshiva. The Netziv was definitely, in certain ways, associated with some of the Zionist movements. Rav Kook himself came from a Hasidic home, was trained, but grew up in a Lithuanian context, so it was kind of like a synthesis of different elements. And Rav Kook, over the course of his lifetime, maintained relationships with many different Gedolei Torah. There's an entire sefer on the relationship between Rav Kook and the Chavetz Chaim. There's a kutris on the relationship between Rav Kook and Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, the Rav of Yerushalayim. You know, Rav Elyashiv was a person who was connected to Rav Kook, that Rav Kook was the Masada Kedushin at his wedding. Rav Elyashiv Zipon Levracha, and was connected, of course, to the Rav Kook's coterie of Talmidim. And so it's hard to know, at least for me, as someone who is a student of Rav Kook, to know precisely where exactly this emerged. But already in his writings in Europe, you could see a very strong, burning desire and yearning for the movement of Knesset Yisrael back to Eretz Yisrael. And then, of course, once he's there, strongly encouraging people to come to Israel, to help build Israel, to stay in Israel. The land of Israel, that is.
Is it possible to conjecture, based on Rav Kook's teachings and his writings, how Rav Kook might view the current state of Israel? I know that's, it's like a what if, but how we would look at, I guess maybe where the question's coming from is obviously his son, Tzvi Yehuda, who took over, and the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Rav. Everybody had very particular positions, especially political positions. Would Rav Kook, Rav Avram Kook, how would he have viewed the state of Israel today?
So, in terms of the hypothetical question, I don't know. I do know, first of all, that Rav Kook had different disciples, different Talmidim, and because he was such an Ish HaEshkolos, he was such a diverse and polychromatic spiritual person, different Talmidim emphasized different aspects of his teachings. You mentioned one, his son, Rabbi Yehuda Zecher Tzadik L'Vracha. Rav Kook was not shy about both embracing, encouraging, and supporting Zionism, but at the same time criticizing what he thought were and what he saw were clear violations of Torah principles, Torah values, and Torah expectations. One of the interesting footnotes in history is that Rav Kook sought to establish his own political and international movement. It's a historical footnote because the movement did not succeed, but Rav Kook referred to this mission, this movement, as Degel Yerushalayim. And this was meant, actually, in his mind, to supersede the Mizrahi, the traditional religious Zionist movement, which apparently he considered to be inadequate to accomplish the ultimate spiritual goal. So Rav Kook was very clear-eyed about the challenges of dealing with secular Zionists, and that the focus needed to be on ultimately establishing a place of Kodesh. I'll give you an example that reflects this vision, that Rav Kook saw the value in the secular Zionists, but also understood that that is not the ultimate goal. And from that, you can draw your own conclusions of how he would say that the current state of Israel and the various governments of Israel, which are not to be conflated, would stack up. Rav Kook arrived in Yafo, in Israel, in the spring of 1904, on Chav Ches Iyar, the date that would later become Yom Yerushalayim. 1904, he arrived. Shortly thereafter, Theodor Herzl, a recognized leader of world Zionism, but also a recognized non-religious, clearly, discernibly, and I think unabashedly non-religious Jew, died. And there was a huge question, a tremendous tumult. What would Rav Kook, the young, nascent rabbi of Yafo and the Moshavot, what would he do? Would he eulogize Herzl? So Rav Kook delivered a eulogy that was entitled Hamisbeit B'Yerushalayim, which is printed in the Ma'amarei Ariyah, in the collected writings. It is a beautiful, incredibly meaningful and poignant tribute in which he never mentions Herzl by name. And he simply speaks to the two Mashiachs, the two Messiahs that are referenced in the Gemara Maseches Sukkah, where there is a Mashiach ben Yosef, and says Rav Kook, Yosef represents that economic and social and political entity that the Jewish people need to create a national structure of Kiddush Hashem, and Yehuda, the representation of Mashiach ben David, of the spiritual content. And that the Gemara and the Baalei Kabbalah, Vilna Gaon, and many others assume that the Mashiach ben Yosef will be killed at the end of time and be superseded by Mashiach ben David. And this idea of the two levels, he talks about elsewhere in the idea of komamius. We asked the Rebbe will bring us back komamius. What is komamius? Two komas, two stages, or two levels, two layers, two planes. Koma, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, koma, two komos, like Adam Arishon. There's the physical, there's the basis, that's Mashiach ben Yosef, and then there's Mashiach ben David. So Rav Kook saw the value in the Mashiach, the Messiah, the physical of Yosef, and he did not expressly mention Herzl by name, but of course he saw that the ultimate vision is Mashiach ben David. So to the extent that we see in our world the advancement of these two ideals of Rav Kook would say, great, matavu manoim, but until the ultimate expression of the Mashiach ben David, we're not quite there. And that's why perhaps Rav Kook called his movement Degel Yerushalayim, because Zion, Rav Kook writes and describes, and many of his Talmidim have developed this idea, Zion, is like a tziyun, is a direction. It's pointing us toward a destination, but it's not the destination. So Zionism, it's not the destination, it's a direction. Yerushalayim, Yireh, Shalem, Shlemus, spiritual light, that's the destination.
And that movement, as you said, did not take off. That was supposed to be a replacement to Mizrahi, a competition to Mizrahi, or
had it succeeded, it probably would have either competed with or superseded Mizrahi, but it did not take hold. And some would argue that Rav Kook's grand vision, in certain ways, it was manifest, in certain ways, it was not, both in his own time and in our time. In certain ways, it was. You take someone like Shai Agnon, who, when Rav Kook met him, saw a tremendous soul, a spiritual seeker, but at that time, Shai Agnon was not wearing the large black yarmulke, which he later donned when he received the Nobel Prize for literature. Rav Kook saw the spiritual energy and the national revival of the language of Hebrew and literature as a davar shebekdusha, the potential for something to be, elevated, not to conflate Kodesh and Chol. Rav Kook was very clear about the distinctions, but to see the kedusha that's potentially built in there. And amazing, look what Shai Agnon gave to the Jewish world and to the world as a whole. But unfortunately, even though Rav Kook gave a blessing, an invocation at the founding of the Hebrew University, with a direct charge not to contravene the Torah and Torah principles, shortly thereafter, somebody came to inform Rav Kook that biblical criticism and heresy was being taught at the Hebrew University, which was a great disappointment to Rav Kook.
And as we move on from Rav Kook, the contributions of religious Zionists, such as Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, Moshe Tzvi Neria, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, what directions did those leaders, these Rabbanim, take?
So Rav Kook's influence on his, what we could call the Holy Chabura, the Chevraya HaKadosha, which included the Nazir, Rav David Cohen, Rav Ari Levin, the Tzaddik of Yerushalayim, Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, the successive Rosh Yeshiva to Rav Kook in Merkaz Harav, his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda. These people, they laid the groundwork for the spiritual flourishing of many of Rav Kook's ideas. Primarily Rav Kook's yeshiva, the Merkaz Harav, the Central Universal Yeshiva, which Rav Kook founded, including elements of machshava, of Jewish thought, which was new to the educational scene, so to speak, in comparison to the traditional yeshivas of the Yeshiva Yashan, the older, more established continuation of the European model. Rav Kook was encouraging people to see Torah in a new way and how it would apply to the new generation. Rav Kook wrote about the challenges of the new generation. And so thinking about how a revival of the national identity affects our Yiddishkeit and how our Yiddishkeit addresses that very much set the stage for the types of questions that are going to emerge later when the state is founded. What kind of government? How do you influence that with the spirit of halacha in terms of Jewish law, not just Turkish or British law? How do you establish an army? Even though Rav Kook never saw the Jewish state or the Jewish army, but Rav Kook's vision of what it means to be oriented to focusing on the klal, of the entirety of the Jewish people, and seeing this as a spiritual movement is going to shape all of those things. And many of those direct Talmidim of Rav Kook went on to establish institutions of their own. Like you mentioned, Rav Moshe Tzvi, close disciple of Rav Kook, he founds the Bnei Akiva movement, which, the Talmud Yerushalmi describes that Rabbi Akiva was a nosei kelim of Bar Kochva. He was somehow at once the great repository of all of Torah Shebaal Peh, and also a supporter of armed revolt, which didn't succeed. But Rabbi Akiva saw that synthesis, which of course is the precursor for the Hesder Yeshiva movement and the incredible sacrifice that we see. Those unbelievably high, exalted tzaddikim that we can't even imagine, the chayalim who are dying al Kiddush Hashem, a high proportion of them today who are literally giving up their lives are disciples and descendants of the disciples of the movement of the Bnei Akiva, of the synthesis of religious Zionism. And we're seeing that Mesiras Nefesh being expressed in an incredible, just unbelievably, overwhelmingly inspiring way in our day, in our age.
Absolutely. Without getting too political, though it's perhaps a political issue, what were the main issues of contention, again, for lack of better words, between religious Zionists and Haredi leaders in the 1940s and 1950s?
So you have to date back that question before, already in the 19th century, where one of the fault lines we alluded to earlier was the question of, is it appropriate to collaborate with people who are not observant, even if it's for a good cause? And another question has to do with, in general, how do we relate to the development of history and secular phenomena and modernity? Is it something that we say, like the Rogatchover writes in a letter, you want to bring the Geula? Learn Torah, do mitzvos. Or is it that we are meant to be active participants in that, which is an old debate. So now you move forward, and these types of historical debates become into a sharper focus when you have to deal with the practical questions of who's making decisions about a new state. It's fascinating. There was a letter calling for the one time in history when there was a notion in 1949 of a unified religious community to vote in the state of Israel behind one block. That would include Mizrahi and Aguda, and there are scores of Rabbanim and Rosh Yeshiva and Admorim who were signed up for this post, this concept, including in that letter, people like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rabbi Cheskel Sarna, great Rosh Yeshiva. And the letter says that the founding of the state of Israel was the Nitzanim HaRishonim Shelo Askalta de Geula. It was the first sparks of the flowering of the redemption. But at the same time, this openness, it didn't last, probably because of some of the age-old questions, which now became practical questions. Who's making decisions about different things? Well, if the majority of Jews in Israel are secular and they are the ones who are driving those decisions, so many religious people are not going to feel comfortable in that environment. So of course, there was a whole range of views of how to relate to the government, both in Hasidic circles and in more Lithuanian circles. Different rebbes had different views, different chachamim, tzaddikim, but the challenges of figuring out how to negotiate what, from a spiritual standpoint, from a religious standpoint, was a b'diavad, not ideal. The state was not run, and is still not yet run, by a government that abides by both the values and the regulations of halacha. So that causes a lot of friction in how to prioritize that. And then you have the various political issues. But I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that Rav Kook himself in the 1920s and 30s had close relationships, even with people with whom he disagreed and who disagreed with him, whether it's Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, the elder from the Yeshiva Yasham. They went on a tour together. There's a book called Eila Maseh that chronicles how they toured the Moshavot, the little farms in the north and the expanse of Israel, to give people chizuk and direction during Shabbos. So yes, there were political divisions, and there always have existed. There are 12 tribes for a reason in Knesset Yisrael. But I think oftentimes people, especially small people, Anoshim Ketanim, you could say, they over-exaggerate the differences rather than emphasizing the commonalities. The great people, the Anoshim Gedolim, who have had those relationships and have made sure to keep a clear eye on what's important, see the overwhelming overlap of values in the different communities that share the same religious values of Torah, of mitzvos, of commitment to Avodas Hashem.
So do you see that the philosophical hashkafic differences between the different religious groups, if you're looking at it compared to the 30s, 40s, 50s, is it still as wide as it is, or is there, as you just alluded to, a lot more common ground than people might really think?
So I can't speak to the situation today in Israel because I don't live in Israel. I live in Chicago, and it would be inappropriate for me to opine on the current state of affairs because I'm not there and I don't know it well. All I can say is that there are many rabbanim, there are many anashim gedolim, great people who have continued to find ways to foster Avos Yisrael, to foster mutual respect, to foster ways of even collaboration to whatever extent that's possible. On the other hand, I'm well aware that the political realities, which include financial implications, have ripple effects. But it's important that people not forget that people like Rav Elyashiv, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, Rav Elyashiv was a dayan in the Rabbinic institution that belonged to the state of Israel, on the Beis Din HaGadol, the Beis Din HaRashi, as were many other great Gedolim. So there is some crossover among different Talmidei Chachamim. Rav Ovadia Yosef, the great Sephardic Gaon, so he was a chief rabbi for the state of Israel. So I think trying to find ways to bring people together is probably what the Ribono Shel Olam really wants to see.
Rabbi Brand, how do you view the future of religious Zionism as it is today? When I grew up, Mizrahi as a political party in Israel kind of represented this middle of the road moderating force that was a part of the government. And I know there's only one part of religious Zionism. Today, it's so confusing. You just don't know who's who represents what in many ways. How do you view religious Zionism today? What's the future and what's the impact on American Jewry?
So those are a whole bunch of different questions, some of
Yes.
which I'm not qualified to talk about, like the situation of the Mizrahi, both from a political standpoint and from a social standpoint in Israel. I can speak about it from a value standpoint, and that is that you see the facts on the ground in terms of the number of religious and spiritually inclined soldiers who are fighting and being Moser Nefesh in Gaza. You see the influence of religious officers, the collaboration that exists between the secular and the religious in the sphere of the army, which has many complications of which I'm aware, and probably far more that I'm not aware. But that reality is thriving. Every community has challenges. Every group of Chassidim has challenges. Every yeshiva, Lithuanian yeshiva, every social group, there are always challenges. So the Mizrahi, of course, has challenges. But the values of focusing on the nation of Kollel Yisrael as a whole, as a core focal value, and the emphasis on Eretz Yisrael, and the ability to synthesize those and to strive to synthesize those, it seems to me that grows stronger all the time. And certainly since Simchas Torah, the events of October 7th, from what I'm hearing, is that there is a lot more conversation about Aliyah, a lot more conversation about a national identity, a connection between others. And I think that is spilling over to those of us here in the United States, that maybe years ago we weren't attuned, and because we are in Golos, we don't even have the right language. We understand such a limited slice of religious life because it's fragmented, as Rav Kook would say, in a Golos mentality. But now that we're seeing models of Mesiras Nefesh for something that's greater, then maybe we're realizing that the ultimate goal of Jewish life is not just to have a neighborhood that has a mikveh and a shul and kosher pizza and a Judaica store with tzitzis. We're starting to realize this vision of something greater, that there is a Knesset Yisrael, there is a national identity. And maybe even we in America can start somehow absorbing some of those ideas, those concepts, those principles. And of course, many people are now drawn to go to Eretz Yisrael, and many of those people are looking dafka for the type of synthesis, this somehow of being able to relate to all of the different facets of the land of Israel and bringing them in a unified way. Rav Kook was the idea of oros, of lights, seeing the light in the different elements, even the elements of the menorah, not the central beam, not the Torah, but the other elements that are drawn toward that. So some people are looking toward that as well. So I think the themes and the animating motifs of religious Zionism are only becoming stronger for people who are spiritually sensitive in our day, even in America.
Okay. And just a little bit before we sign off, just a little bit about the Torah Mitzion, Kollel, and your activities and in Chicago and beyond Chicago, and how that's playing out.
So our Kollel is a unique hybrid. It's a collaboration. This iteration of the collaboration began 16 years ago, where the community of Chicago sought to merge and blend what they had previously as a Torah Mitzion exclusive Azrieli Kollel with having Chavrei Kollel who are going to come from YU, from Yeshiva University and other places in America, to create a hybrid where we have consistency of fellows who are planning to stay in America. We have many of our Kollel alumni who are in America, most of whom are in Chicago, but they're playing Avodas HaKodesh roles in shuls and schools, but also have gone into other disciplines, are leaders in our community. This hub of Limud HaTorah is centered around the Kollel based medrash, where the Chaverim, where we're learning every day. This year we're learning Maseches Zvachim in the morning, we're learning Hilchos Shabbos in the afternoon. But then that circle of influence expands into the community. So we have a women's institute, we have an outreach element, we have programs for kids and adults. Our goal is to raise the whole level of ruchnius, to facilitate and nurture spiritual growth across our Chicagoland community. And we do that by partnering with various institutions and moslos and adding Torah resources. And all of this is done with the values, the Masorah that we have received from our Rabbeim, whether that's Rabbeim who are from Europe through the connections through the Soloveitchik dynasty, Rabbi Yosef Tov Halevi Soloveitchik and other Rosh Yeshiva at YU, and those influencing us from Torah Mitzion from Israel. So we will have a Monday night Chabura on a particular topic, a Tuesday night Daf Yomi Chabura, but then we'll also have a Yom HaZikaron program where we feature an emphasis on those who are Moser Nefesh, both terror victims and Chayalim. So we're trying to raise the level of Ruchnius with that Ruach, that spirit of our unique Masorah.
All right, Brand, thank you so much. And it's been extremely informative and wish you continued success. You go from Chayil for Chayil in all your activities. And again, we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I will just close by thanking you for sharing this important concept with the whole world, with all of your wonderful listening audience. And this is one of the great gifts that we have been given in our age, that what was maybe when I got here was a much more locally focused group of people who are learning Torah together physically in Chicago. Over the past years, it has certainly expanded. And this is just one more medium through which the Torah that we're learning here is able to shine beyond Chicago, beyond the United States, to Israel and beyond. So thank you for that special opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.